Today, we're going to be talking about a universally shared human experience, grief and loss. I mean, it's the oldest question in the book, right? Why do bad things happen? Well, we're going to examine a really profound Islamic theological framework to unpack the exact mechanics behind why hardships occur, how they tie into destiny, and the ultimate reward that's promised to those who endure them. It's an incredibly structured, frankly fascinating lens through which to view human suffering.
Okay, let's jump right in with a super fundamental question. Why does Allah test believers? There's this really common misconception out there that simply claiming to have faith somehow guarantees you a smooth, easy, totally pain-free life. But this theology argues the exact opposite. Claiming faith isn't the end of your journey, it's actually the trigger for a pretty rigorous testing phase.
The 29th chapter of the Qur'an hits this idea head-on. It asks, do people think they will be left to say, we believe, and they will not be tried? Essentially, you aren't just going to be left alone after saying, I believe. Instead, that declaration initiates a worldly trial. The early generations were tested, and current believers are going to be tested too. It's basically a historical and theological constant. But that brings up a really important question. If God is all-knowing, why does he need to test people at all? So, how exactly does theology resolve this dilemma? Well, divine testing is not about God trying to discover something he didn't already know. His knowledge is absolute. However, testing happens here in the physical world so that a person's sincerity or lack of it is practically proven. It generates undeniable practical evidence of our human choices. The logic is that if God were to send people directly to heaven or hell without testing them, they could argue it was totally unfair, right? They'd say, hey, I would have passed the test if you'd just given me the chance. By actually going through the trials, there's literally no room left for excuses. Section 1. The mechanics of hardship. Now that we understand the why behind the testing, we've got to look at the how. How do these tests actually manifest? Surah Al-Asr outlines 4 very strict conditions for success. You start out with faith and righteous deeds, but actually that's not enough. Step 3 is advising others to the truth. And this right here is exactly where the hardship kicks in. Because the moment you start speaking the truth, you'll inevitably face pushback and difficulties from society. Therefore, step 4, patience, becomes an absolutely mandatory requirement for success. You simply cannot have the truth without the trials that follow it. So, what do those trials actually look like in everyday life? Surah Al-Baqarah explicitly details the forms these worldly tests will take, and they are severe, for sure. We're talking fear, hunger, financial ruin, the loss of loved ones, and the loss of your livelihood or crops. These are practically guaranteed to happen. But crucially, glad tidings and good news are promised specifically to those who manage to remain patient when these exact losses strike. The real secret here is how one reacts in that split-second moment of loss. When a calamity hits, the prescribed response is this profound shift in perspective. Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. To God we belong, and to him we return. Uttering this, just acknowledging that everything comes from God and eventually returns to God, transforms raw grief into an opportunity for massive spiritual reward. A believer who says this during a tragedy and prays for a better substitute will find their sorrow replaced with a divine reward. And the mercy built into the system extends to the absolutely smallest of pains. According to the hadith traditions of Bukhari and Muslim, even if a mere thorn pricks a believer, it serves a higher purpose. Literally no suffering is wasted in this framework. Every bit of anxiety, every single illness, even the tiny prick of a thorn, acts as an expiation, automatically erasing some of the believer's sins. Section 2. The theological anchor, destiny. To fully wrap our heads around this perspective on hardship, we have to zoom way out and look at the macro-level concept of preordainment. Surah Al-Hadid presents this brilliant psychological anchor. It explains that every single calamity, whether we're talking about a global disaster like an earthquake or a deeply personal trial like an incurable illness, was already written in the Lawh-e-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet, long before it ever happened. Why does that matter? Because knowing a loss was pre-written prevents you from falling into crippling despair. And on the flip side, knowing your success was pre-written prevents you from arrogant boasting. It perfectly stabilizes the human ego through both our lowest lows and our highest highs. Section 3. Historical context and warnings. We really shouldn't look at our modern hardships in a vacuum. To fully understand this, we've got to look back at the earliest believers. Take a companion named Khabbab bin al-Arat, for example. He was suffering horrific torture. Early believers were literally being sawn in half and having their flesh torn with iron combs.
When Khabbab went to the Prophet to ask for a prayer to just end the suffering, the Prophet actually became stern. He completely reoriented Khabbab's perspective, reminding him of the severe trials of the past, demanding unwavering patience in the present, and prophesying a future where faith would bring absolute peace and safety, from Sana'a all the way to Hadramaut. He was teaching him that the current suffering was just one small part of a much larger, victorious historical arc.
This leads us to a highly counterintuitive question. When looking at all this suffering, persecution, and starvation, what do you think the Prophet actually feared the most for his followers? You'd probably assume it was poverty, right? Or maybe being wiped out by their enemies.
But the ultimate test wasn't poverty at all. It was actually abundant wealth and power. The Prophet literally swore he did not fear poverty for them. Instead, he feared that the wealth of the world would be opened up to them. He warned that they'd start competing for this wealth, become greedy, and it would ultimately destroy them just like it destroyed previous nations. And looking back at history, we see early governance eventually devolved into kingships, palaces, and dynasties, proving that exact prediction completely true. Because ease and wealth are so incredibly dangerous, hardship is actually seen as a spiritual safeguard. In fact, there is a clear hierarchy to this according to the traditions. Who suffers the most? Not the weakest, but the strongest. The prophets face the absolute most severe tests, followed by the next best in faith, and then the next best. The intensity of your trial is scaled directly to the strength of your faith. And the stunning conclusion here is that a person can be tested so thoroughly that they eventually walk the earth completely free of sin.
Section 4. The Grand Perspective. To really summarize this whole theology of hardship, we can use a quick mathematical analogy to weigh our temporary worldly life against eternity. Just consider the sheer scale of eternity for a second. Imagine losing one single rupee, but in exchange you gain 1 billion rupees. Would anyone, anywhere, consider that a bad deal? Of course not. Enduring a temporary, finite hardship in this world, the 1 rupee, is merely a necessary investment to unlock an infinite, eternal reward in the hereafter, the 1 billion rupees. In fact, compared to eternity, the worldly loss is practically zero.
This scale is perfectly captured in a very famous hadith from Sahih Muslim. Imagine dipping your finger into the ocean and pulling it out. The tiny amount of moisture on your fingertip, that represents this entire world. All of its pain, all of its wealth, all of its lifespan. And that vast, infinite, endless ocean in front of you, that is the hereafter. When you visualize it like that, any worldly suffering, no matter how intense it feels in the moment, is just a fraction of a drop compared to the eternal success awaiting those who remain patient. Which leaves us with an incredibly powerful reflective prayer. O Allah, protect us from the fire. When you view life through this highly structured theological lens, the goal completely shifts. The objective is no longer to avoid every little worldly scratch or financial loss, because those are just temporary drops of water. The ultimate goal is to pass the practical test of faith, maintain patience, and secure eternal safety in the infinite ocean of the hereafter. It really forces us all to ask, are we too focused on the drop while completely ignoring the ocean,